racism is inherently a challenge to human rights because it denies the view that every human being is a person of equal worth with any other.
The build-up to this conference has prompted an extraordinary mobilization of society in many different countries. It has raised expectations which we must not disappoint.
We must join hands and work together to achieve a constructive, substantive agenda. Racism is truly a global issue, and we need it to be discussed at the global level, however sensitive and difficult that may be.
Today, apartheid lies dead, but sadly, racism lives on in all regions and in all societies. It's time to acknowledge and repair long-standing wrongs and reverse their consequences.
Despite what we've been through as Asian Americans, New Yorkers, we're still here fighting every day for our shared future.
The pain that I went through, it was horrific watching my brother pass away. He was tortured to death. That was a modern day execution.
Systemic racism is a set of racialized norms that have been embedded in our law, our policy, our practices. And what it's done is really licensed atrocity.
In light of these profound and wide-ranging injustices, there is an urgent need to confront the legacy of enslavement, the transatlantic slave trade, colonialism, and successive racially discriminatory policies and systems, and to seek reparatory justice.
We forgive, but we don't forget. It's a long past. We are human beings. You know, we can forgive man to man, but we will never forget. And even those people who did it should never forget, so that never again humanity will be faced with such kind of atrocity.
If we don't fight together, racism will kill us all. I don't want to suffocate in a world enamored of hate. I want to breathe. I want to breathe in the sweet and rejuvenating air of compassion and cooperation. I want to live fully. I want to extend the gift of a full, unconstricted life to all people around the world. Will you join me?
The fifth plenary meeting of the General Assembly is called to order. I declare open the high-level meeting of the General Assembly to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the adoption of the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action. This meeting is held in accordance with General Assembly Resolution 75/237 of 31st December 2020 and 75/320 of 2nd September 2021, and takes place under sub-item B of Agenda Item 72, entitled Comprehensive Implementation of and Follow-up to the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action. I warmly welcome you all to this high-level meeting, which will focus on the theme Reparations, Racial Justice and Equality for People of African Descent. The General Assembly has before it a draftment from the rostrum. Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, dear colleagues, thank you for the opportunity to address this commemoration of the 20th anniversary of the adoption of the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action. I congratulate the permanent representatives of Portugal and South Africa for successfully leading consultations on the political declaration that is to be adopted today. Excellencies, when the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action was adopted in 2001, it was done with emphasis to tackle racial discrimination and intolerance. Sadly, 2 decades later, the doctrine is still being pursued. This is not to say that the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action has failed, but rather that we have not done enough. We as a global community have not done enough to tackle the pervasiveness of racism, racial discrimination, intolerance, and xenophobia. Tackling racism and all its forms is a moral responsibility for justice. Racism begets violence, displacement, and inequity. It lives on because we allow it to. It penetrates society because we fail to acknowledge diversity. The Durban Declaration and Programme of Action is a comprehensive toolkit to address racism. It makes references to various groups of people, such as Africans and people of African descent, Asians and people of Asian descent, indigenous peoples, minorities, youth, women, and children. Excellencies, the chosen theme of repatriations, racial justice, and equality for people of African descent is very timely. It serves as a reminder that in our efforts to recover from the pandemic is the high need to acknowledge the past and to address the ingrained racism in our societies. Excellencies, my presidency for the 76th session will include 5 rays of hope, one of which is specifically focused on human rights and addressing racism in all its forms. As the United Nations, with human rights as a founding pillar of the organization, we must never lose sight of this core principle. It must permeate everything we do. Excellencies, like so much else, the global pandemic has exacerbated underlying conditions and exposed fault lines. The same holds true for racism. We saw and still see the marginalized and the vulnerable fall further behind. Many have been denied equal access to health, education, and security. These pre-existing structural weaknesses were a recipe for disaster long before COVID-19. The pandemic has only made the divide and injustice starker. There are many lessons we can take from the pandemic, from who has been affected and how. Let us be self-aware enough to recognize these failings and to seek racial equality, to close that divide and build the resilience of those who we have sadly left behind. As we do so, we must ensure that African descendants are adequately represented in decision and policy-making processes for their rights to be meaningfully reflected and translate into doable policies. They must be part of the conversation. Excellencies, as I stated in the opening of the general debate, this moment in time is a turning point. Let us turn the tide on racism and intolerance. We must leave no one behind. In closing, allow me to reiterate the importance of acknowledging the past, whether in the form of a formal apology or through other means. We must own up to and acknowledge what has happened. You cannot move past what is not addressed. I encourage the international community, individuals, leaders, and stakeholders to engage in deeper and honest dialogue to address this global issue. I thank you. I now give the floor to the Secretary General of the United Nations, His Excellency Antonio Guterres.
Mr. President of the General Assembly, Excellencies, at the dawn of this century, world leaders and human rights advocates journeyed to Durban, determined to banish the hatred and prejudice that disfigured previous centuries. To make, in the words of the original declaration, this a century of human rights and to eradicate racism in all its abhorrent forms and manifestations. This journey for equality and justice did not begin in Durban. The path was paved by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and followed in the footsteps of the International Convention on the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. Today, 2 decades on, our journey continues. The 20th anniversary of the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action offers an important opportunity to reflect on where we stand and where we need to go. Racism and racial discrimination still permeate the institutions, social structures, and everyday life in every society. Structural racism and systematic injustice still deny people their fundamental human rights. Africans and people of African descent, minority communities, indigenous peoples, migrants, refugees, displaced persons, so many others, all continue to confront hatred, stigmatization, scapegoating, discrimination, and violence. Xenophobia, misogyny, hateful conspiracies, white supremacy and neo-Nazi ideologies are spreading, amplified in echo chambers of hate. From glaring infringements to creeping transgressions, human rights are under assault. Racism is often the cruel catalyst. The linkages between racism and gender inequality are unmistakable, and we see some of the worst impacts in the overlaps and intersections of discrimination suffered by women from radicalized communities and minority groups. We are witnessing a troubling rise in anti-Semitism, a harbinger throughout history of discrimination against others. We must condemn without reservation or hesitation the racism and discrimination of growing anti-Muslim bigotry, the mistreatment of minority Christians and other forms of intolerance around the world. Let me be clear, whoever uses this process or any other platform for anti-Semitic diatribes, anti-Muslim discourse, hateful speech, and baseless assertions only denigrates our essential fight against racism. Mesdames et Messieurs les représentants.
Ladies and gentlemen, representatives. Scanning the global landscape today, something more hopeful has come into view. A movement for racial justice and equality has emerged with unprecedented force, reach, and impact. This new awakening, often led by women and young people, has created momentum we must seize upon. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has launched a transformative agenda to help dismantle systemic racism, ensure accountability, and deliver reparatory justice. The Human Rights Council has established a new independent mechanism to advance racial justice and equality in law enforcement. The Permanent Forum of People of African Descent, created by the General Assembly, is another example of meaningful progress towards a systemic response to systemic racism. I call on every member state to take concrete actions, including through policy, legislation, and more granular data collection, in support of all these efforts at the national and global level. Together, we must work to recognize the contemporary resonance of past crimes that continue to haunt our present. The lingering traumas, the transgenerational suffering, the structural inequalities so deeply rooted in centuries of enslavement and colonial exploitation. And we must reverse the consequences of generations of exclusion and discrimination, including their obvious social and economic dimensions, through reparatory justice frameworks. The COVID-19 pandemic is damning proof of just how far we still are from righting past wrongs. In some cases, mortality rates have been 3 times higher for marginalized groups. Women from minority groups have often been the worst off, facing an escalation in gender-based violence, losing jobs and educational opportunities in greater numbers than anyone else, and benefiting the least from fiscal stimulus.
Excellencies, the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action was meant to break the vicious cycle in which discrimination leads to deprivation and poverty deepens discrimination. We can overcome these harmful afflictions and heal if we recognize diversity as richness, if we understand, as Durban did, that the fight against racism is also a global, universal effort and a concrete struggle in every society. No country can claim to be free from it. If we act to redress the global, political, economic and structural power imbalances rooted in colonial rule, enslavement and exploitation that continue to blight our present, if we work to ensure that everyone feels respected in their individual identity while feeling valued as a member of a society as a whole, if we make sure that all of us, regardless of race, color, descent, national or ethnic origin, gender, religion, sexual orientation or other status, can live lives of dignity and opportunity, if and only if we stand together as one human family, rich in diversity, equal in dignity and rights, united in solidarity. At a time when we feel more divided than ever, let us unite around our common humanity. Let us remember what Nelson Mandela said: "No one is born a racist. People must learn to hate. But if they can learn to hate," Mandela went on to say, "they can be taught to love, for love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite." Let us heed his hopeful words today and recommit ourselves to this essential purpose. And I thank you.
I thank the Secretary General for his statement. We will now hear the other speakers for the opening plenary meeting in accordance with Resolution 75/320. I now introduce the pre-recorded statement of Michelle Bachelet, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights.
Excellencies, colleagues, 20 years ago, the international community met in Durban, South Africa, to address racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Eliminating violations of human dignity, equality, and rights was very clearly a matter of the greatest urgency. But 2 decades on, the inequalities and suffering they generate for Africans and people of African descent, Asian and people of Asian descent, members of ethnic and religious minorities, including victims of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, indigenous peoples and migrants, continue to hold back all our societies and harm both sustainable development and social cohesion. It is vital that we rise above past controversies and come together to combat racism and related discrimination in the world today. Excellencies, we have taken steps that have laid a strong foundation for real change. The proclamation by this Assembly of the International Decade for People of African Descent, establishment of a new expert mechanism to advance racial justice in law enforcement, and operationalization of the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent further strengthen our global anti-racism architecture. In July, following our comprehensive report on racial discrimination, including in law enforcement, I put forward a 4-point agenda towards transformative change for racial justice and equality that I believe sets out building blocks for tangible and sustainable progress. But millions of people continue to bear the burden of past and contemporary forms of racism and exclusion, including historical denial of their humanity, the legacy of colonial exploitation, and the inhuman and criminal enslavement of generations of women, men, and children of African descent. It is important to address these lasting consequences, including through appropriate forms of reparations. Reparation should be broad-based and need to include measures aimed at restitution, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition. This may include formal acknowledgement and apologies, memorialization, and institutional and educational reforms. For reparations to be effective, all these elements are needed. We should be clear, though, that these efforts must go beyond symbolism and that they do require political, human, and financial capital. Such costs should be seen alongside the enrichment of many economies through enslavement and exploitation, and recognition of this reality should encourage genuine consideration of substantive reparations. As the DDPA recognizes, there is also a need to strengthen and enhance international cooperation to increase equality of opportunities for trade, economic growth, and sustainable development. To recognize the past and truly leave no one behind in the future, it is essential to promote equality not only within, but also among countries, transforming our world towards social, economic, and environmental sustainability. And I would encourage greater international engagement on these issues of reparatory justice. Excellencies, we are at an important juncture to take the anti-racism agenda forward. To effectively tackle racial discrimination and the inequality experienced by people of African descent requires a comprehensive approach, as set out by the DDPA and developed in my own agenda for transformative change, with concrete strategies and actionable time-bound targets. It will also be important to address the multiple and intersectional manifestations of racial discrimination. A woman who is a migrant, who is a person of African descent, and who is poor, starkly faces multiple and intersectional forms of discrimination. And this recognition of the DDPA of the realities of such multiple discrimination must be integrated into laws and policies to address and repair the inequality and racism faced by such victims, including by integrating a gender perspective. My office will continue to support domestic action and international cooperation to eliminate racial discrimination and achieve racial justice, including in coordinating the International Decade for People of African Descent. But the anti-discrimination agenda concerns and belongs to all of us, irrespective of race, color, descent, ethnic or national origin, affiliation, religion, or belief. Stronger efforts must be employed by all stakeholders to implement the goals laid out in Durban. I paid tribute, in particular, to the courage and resilience of civil society organizations combating racism around the world. Today's mobilization of activism brings further promise that racial justice can be achieved for people of African descent and all others suffering racial discrimination. I thank you.
I thank the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights for her statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa to introduce the statement of the Head of State.
Michelle Bachelet.
The distinguished representative of South Africa, will introduce the statement of the head of state.
President of the General Assembly, Mr. Abdullah Shahid.
Mr. President, thank you very much. Secretary General, distinguished delegates, I'm pleased to introduce President Cyril Matamela Ramaphosa of South Africa to deliver his statement on this very important occasion. I thank you, Mr. President.
President of the General Assembly, Mr. Abdullah Shahid. General Secretary of the United Nations, Mr. Antonio Guterres. United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Ms. Michelle Bachelet. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is 20 years since the world adopted the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action. And it is 25 years since the people of South Africa adopted a democratic constitution. In that constitution, we affirmed that as South Africans, we are called upon to build a society based on social justice and fundamental human rights, with a view to correcting the injustices of our past. These words ring true for all the injustices that have been committed against many peoples around the world. Slavery was one of the darkest periods in the history of humankind and a crime of unparalleled barbarity. Its legacy persists in the Americas, in the Caribbean, in Europe, the Middle East, and in Africa itself. Millions of descendants of Africans who were sold into slavery remain trapped in lives of underdevelopment, disadvantage, discrimination, and poverty. South Africa calls on the United Nations to put the issue of reparations for victims of the slave trade on its agenda. We support the adoption of special measures, including affirmative action and targeted financial assistance as restitution to communities whose ancestors were sold into slavery. We further support all measures being undertaken to address the historic and contemporary discrimination against people of African descent. This includes increasing representation of people of African descent in global institutions and in positions of leadership. As we strive to correct the wrongs of the past, we must combat the racism, sexism, and national chauvinism of the present. Racism directed at ethnic minorities, migrants, refugees, the LGBTQI+ community, and other marginalized groups has led to the denial of opportunity, to institutionalized discrimination, and to violence. 20 years ago, at the World Conference Against Racism held in South Africa, we committed to an anti-discrimination agenda that would bring new hope and change to the lives of millions. Just as we have united to combat the COVID-19 pandemic, let us recommit ourselves to implement the Durban Declaration and Platform for Action. We must pursue this objective with energy and goodwill. Ending racism is a fight in which each of us has a stake. Let us allow humanism to be our guide and solidarity. And solidarity must also be our strongest force. We are called upon by history to redouble our efforts to build a world that is free of racism, to right the wrongs of the past, and to restore the human dignity of all. I thank you.
I thank the President of the Republic of South Africa for his statement.